Now let's move on to our next segment, and that will be the Android Basic segment. And this week we're doing the privacy, permissions, account activity, and personal data part two. I will now go into this area and we'll take a look at the permissions manager. That's the one we're focusing on this week. I'll now go into privacy, permissions, account activity, and personal data.
Privacy, permissions, account activity, personal data.
I'll tap here to activate.
Privacy. Navigate up, button, out of list.
Now I'm going to tap on Permissions Manager. Last week, Fee showed us this on the Samsung phone, and today I'm looking at it from the Pixel viewpoint. And I would like to believe that this is true with some of the stock devices such as Sony, Motorola, and Nokia. So let's go into Permissions Manager and see what we have here. I'll now navigate to the Permissions Manager.
Permission Manager, control app access to your data in list.
Control app access to our data. I'll tap here.
Permission Manager. Back, button, out of list.
The first item that we find in this Permissions Manager will be
Body sensors, 0 of 0 apps allowed in list.
body sensors. Let's tap here to see what this is all about.
Body sensors. Back, button, out of list. Body sensors, apps with this permission can access sensor data about your vital signs, heading, in list.
And so basically about your vital signs, and these apps could have access to it. Let's see what we've got.
Allowed, heading.
Under the heading allowed, I've got
No apps allowed.
none allowed. Next.
Not allowed, heading.
Under not allowed, I've got
No apps denied.
no apps denied either. Let's go back to the previous screen and look at the next category.
Permission Manager. Body sensors, 0 of 0 apps allowed in list.
From body sensors, we move to
Calendar, 5 of 15 apps allowed.
calendar, and I am told that there are a total of 5 apps that are allowed out of some 15 apps. Let's go in here and look at some of those.
Calendar, out of list. Calendar. Calendar, apps with this permission can access your calendar, heading, in list.
And let's look under allowed.
Allowed, heading. Android Auto.
Android Auto,
Calendar, accessed in past 24 hours. Gmail.
Gmail,
Google, accessed in past 24 hours. Wear OS by Google, accessed in past 24 hours. Not allowed, heading.
and then not allowed, and most of the apps below here, or all of the apps rather below here, will not be allowed, and some of them would be
Chroma keyboard. Clock. Discover.
on and on will go. I'll go back to the previous screen and let's look at the next category.
Permission Manager. Calendar, 5 of 15 apps allowed in list.
Below calendar, we've got
Call logs, 7 of 12 apps allowed.
call logs, and we are told that 7 apps are being allowed. And let's go in here and see which apps these are.
Call logs. Back, button, out of list.
And the summary is
Call logs, apps with this permission can read and write phone call log, heading, in list.
let's go.
Allowed, heading.
We've got
Android Auto. Duo. Google, accessed in past 24 hours. Google Fi. Phone, accessed in past 24 hours. Telegram. Wear OS by Google. Not allowed, heading.
and then we come to the not allowed heading. And of course, all the apps below here are not allowed. Let's go back to the previous screen.
Permission Manager. Call logs, 7 of 12 apps allowed, in list.
From call logs, we move on to
Camera, 51 of 153 apps allowed.
camera, and I'm told there are a total of 51 apps allowed. Now, this sometimes doesn't necessarily mean that all the apps have access, but what it simply might mean is that they have access only when in use. and they may not even be actively having access at all, but they are determined as having access because one has placed them in the only have access while in use. So let's go in here and see what we have.
Camera. Back button out of list.
And the summary here would be
Camera. Apps with this permission can take pictures and record video. Heading in list.
and then
Allowed all the time. Heading.
allowed all the time, meaning apps that have access to the camera all the time.
No apps allowed.
And of course, none is allowed. So it's just like I was saying earlier, even though there are 51 apps here that are allowed to use the camera, it does not necessarily mean that this app have constant access to my camera. Instead, they only have access when I have the app opened. And some of these would include the following. So as you can see, not even my native camera has access to the camera all the time.
Allowed only while in use. Heading.
While in use,
4K Camera Pro. iPoly Vision. Assistive text detection. Brincanticom Braille OCR. Brightcam Vision. Camera. Camera 4K Pro. Chrome. Drive. Duo.
there you go. These are some of the apps that have access, but they will only have that access when I have them running. Let's go back to the previous screen.
Permission Manager. Camera, 51 of 153 apps allowed in list.
Now, below camera, we've got the next category, and that will be
Contacts, 20 of 114 apps allowed.
contacts. And I'm told that 20 out of 100 plus are allowed. Let's go in here and see what these apps are.
Contacts. Back button out of list.
And its summary would read,
Contacts. Apps with this permission can access your contacts. Heading in list.
let's go from here.
Allowed. Heading.
Allowed.
Acapella TTS Voices.
Acapella TTS engine. And the reason why this would have access to your contact is because it needs that to know which account is subscribed to the Acapella or is licensed to Acapella. And thus, the reason why it is among these ones. Let's go to the next.
Android Auto. Calendar. Contacts. Accessed in Drive. Duo.
And so things like contacts and Drive and Duo, of course, if I want to share anything on my Drive, I'll need access to my contacts so I could pick out who I want to send a file to and things like that. The same thing goes to Duo. If I want to make a call or whatever the case may be, I'll need to have access to that contact in order to be able to make such a call. Let's go back to the previous screen.
Permission Manager. Contacts, 20 of 114 apps allowed in list.
From contacts, we move on to
Files and Media, 131 of 287 apps allowed.
files and media. And this probably is the biggest because the reason being the fact that most apps would need access because whether you're storing recordings from them or you're downloading files using those things or you're accessing some files, they will need to have access. Let's go in here and see what we have.
Files and Media. Back button out of list.
And here's what that summary says.
Files and Media. Apps with this permission can access photos, media, and files on your device. Heading in list.
So media, photos, videos, and all of that, they all fall in this category. And so we have
Allowed to manage all files. Heading. 4K Camera Pro.
Of course, if I'm taking any pictures or any videos, I'll need to be able to store those for viewing.
Amanda Voice English US.
Amanda Voice TTS, of course, if I want to have access to the voice data, I need to have access to, or it needs to have access to the files, and thus having this permission.
Audio Recorder.
I don't need to explain this because if I record something, I'll need to be able to have access to it storing what I'm recording.
AVS.
Another video app.
BLB.
That's my Bible there. If I want to have an offline Bible, I'll need it to have access to writing files. Let's go back to the previous screen.
Permission Manager. Files and Media, 131 of 287 apps allowed in list.
From Files and Media, let's move to the next category, and this will be
Location, 28 of 103 apps allowed.
Location. This is probably one of the big ones and most important ones. Let's go in here and see which of these apps are having access to my location.
Location. Back, button, out of list.
I'll touch the middle toward the top to hear the summary.
Location. Apps with this permission can access this device's location, heading, in list.
So knowing where my device is and
Allowed all the time, heading.
allowed all the time, and of course you can change these things and deny them.
Google, last accessed 5:28 p.m.
That's Google, and this is a phone that I don't use. Next,
Google Fi.
my Google Fi, that's my phone service provider, even though I don't have it on here, but I had it on here a little while ago before I switched to my Pixel 6.
Nest.
Nest, and this will be my thermostat. It'll know when I'm coming home or when I'm away from home. This time is hot. I want the house cool when I'm getting home.
Allowed only while in use, heading.
And then we got allowed only while in use and things like
Android Auto. Blind Explorer. Calendar. Camera. Chase. Chrome. Default print service. Explore.
there you go. And these are some of the many apps that are allowed only while I am using the app. Let's go back to the previous screen.
Permission Manager. Location, 28 of 103 apps allowed in list.
Moving away from location, we come to
Microphone, 34 of 106 apps allowed.
microphone, and there are a total of some 34 apps out of some 106 plus apps allowed. Let's go in here and see which of these apps have access to my microphone.
Microphone. Back, button, out of list.
And the summary would be
Microphone. Apps with this permission can record audio, heading, in list.
and from here we've got
Allowed all the time, heading.
allowed all the time.
No apps allowed.
No apps are allowed to have access to my microphone all the time. However,
Allowed only while in use, heading.
allowed only while in use, and some of these are allowed.
4K Camera Pro. Android Auto. Audio Recorder. Audiolab. As Screen Recorder. Brightcam Vision. Camera. Chrome.
And it goes on and on. Let's now go back to the previous screen.
Permission Manager. Microphone, 34 of 106 apps allowed in list.
From recording using the microphone, the next category will be
Nearby devices, 50 of 79 apps allowed.
nearby devices, and we touched a little bit on these, and this would have to do with apps that could have access to like your Bluetooth devices, for example. Let's go in here and see what apps are some of these that have access to my nearby devices.
Nearby devices. Back, button, out of list.
And its summary would be
Nearby devices. Apps with this permission can find, connect to, and determine the relative position of nearby devices, heading, in list.
and then we've got
Allowed, heading.
under allowed, we've got
At voice allowed reader.
at voice allowed reader. Of course, I want to be able to listen to my books using my Bluetooth device, so therefore it has access to nearby devices.
Android Auto. Android System Intelligence. Arlo Secure.
That's one of my security cam and all of that.
Audio Recorder.
Let's now go back to the previous screen.
Permission Manager. Nearby devices, 50 of 79 apps allowed in list.
From nearby devices, the next category that we've got will be
Phone, 16 of 94 apps allowed.
I've got a bunch of apps allowed to use the phone. Let's take a look at some of these.
Phone. Back, button, out of list.
And the summary says thus.
Phone. Apps with this permission can make and manage phone calls, heading, in list.
And
Allowed, heading. Android Auto. Contacts. Duo. Google, accessed in Google Fi, accessed Google Play Store.
And on it goes. Let's go back to the previous screen.
Permission Manager. Phone, 16 of 94 apps allowed, in list.
The next category below that phone category will be
Physical Activity, 5 of 11 apps allowed.
physical activity. And this would include things like maps, I believe, because if I'm walking, it will need to have access to what I'm doing to tell me turn right on so and so street and things like that. Let's go in here and see what the apps are that have access to that physical activity.
Physical Activity, out of list. Physical
And
Activity.
the summary says thus.
Physical Activity. Apps with this permission can access your physical activity, like walking, biking, driving, step count, and more, heading, in list.
Aha, exactamundo my point. Let's look at it now.
Allowed, heading.
Under allowed, we've got
Digital Well-being. Fit.
fit,
Google, accessed in past 24 hours. Maps.
maps,
Personal Safety. Not allowed, heading.
and then we got to the not allowed. Let's go back to the previous screen.
Permission Manager. Physical Activity, 5 of 11 apps allowed, in list.
Below physical activity, the next category we've got will be,
SMS, 7 of 13 apps allowed.
I've got a total of 7 apps that are allowed to send or view SMS messages. Let's go in here and take a look.
SMS. Back, button, out of list.
Its summary goes thus.
SMS, apps with this permission can send and view SMS messages, heading, in list.
Let's go look under allowed.
Allowed, heading. Android Auto. Google, accessed in past. Google Fi, accessed in Google Play Store. Messages, accessed in past. Phone. Wear OS by Google. Not allowed, heading.
And we got to the not allowed. Let's go back to the previous screen.
Permission Manager. SMS, 7 of 13 apps allowed, in list.
From SMS, the next category we've got is,
Additional permissions, 4 more.
we are told additional permissions and 4 more. Let's tap here and see what these are.
Additional permissions. Back, button, out of list. Additional permissions. Car information, 0 of 0 apps allowed, in list.
Car information, 0 apps allowed.
Install shortcuts, 0 of 0 apps allowed.
Next.
Read instant messages, 0 of 1 apps allowed.
Read instant messages, 0 of 1 apps allowed. In other words, I think we've talked about this in one of our episodes, but this is where you could go in and allow something like the Google Frame services so that when you get a message, it can be read aloud to you. It's up to you. I don't have it allowed, but if I go in here, you'll see what I'm talking about.
Read instant messages. Back, button, out of list. Read instant messages. Apps with this permission can read data from the Google Talk content provider. Heading, in list.
So for example, if I have an app that I wanted to be able to use or read my instant messages or incoming messages, I'll have to do that. And here I got
Allowed, heading.
under allowed, I've got nothing.
No apps allowed.
And then
Not allowed, heading.
not allowed.
Google Services Framework.
Google Services Framework. I could enable this so it could read my incoming messages, but I don't like hearing my messages get read aloud, so I don't have any of those running. Let's go back to the previous screen.
Additional permissions. Read instant messages, 0.
And the other one would be the right.
Write instant messages, 0 of 1 apps allowed.
And it's the same thing. If we go in here, you're going to see that same Google Frame services. Let's go back to the previous screen now.
Permission Manager. Additional permissions, 4 more, in list.
That would be the last one in there, but then there's a little item in here that says,
To protect your data, permissions have been removed from apps that you haven't used in a few months.
so in other words, there are some apps that have been removed because I haven't been using this phone in quite a while. So in other words, if you don't use an app or you don't use your phone for a while or you don't use an app on your phone for a while, After a while, that permission would be automatically revoked because that app has not been used. And I don't remember if this is something that started with Android 12 or even goes back to Android 11. I would like to think that it goes back to Android 11, but I'm not very sure about that as I don't have one handy now to look at it. But that is what this permissions manager is all about. And now, guys, let's talk about some of these things that we like and some that we don't really care about. Well, that's it about that permissions manager. So, you guys, I think I want to start by saying that for me, though, the thing that I really like, and guys, correct me, I think this granular control probably started back with Pi, even though it wasn't quite there. But I think we have semblance of this permissions management, finer permission management, starting back with Android Pie, wasn't it? I think so. And it kept getting better and better with Android 10 and Android 11 and Android 12. And even now that we're on 13 beta, it's even a whole lot better. And so for me, I think what I like is especially the ability to say, hey, if I haven't used this app in such a long time, then those permissions will be revoked. I think that's one of my favorites. How about you guys?
I like the amount of control that it gives you over lots of different things, and the fact that you can look in there and see when a permission was last used, like, and which app used it, like the camera or the microphone or something. Because it can tell you sometimes it might be that you didn't realize an app was using that. So that can be helpful. Or I guess there could be the other way around of that is that you could have an app that's not working properly, and it might be because you have to give it permission to, I don't know, use GPS if it's an app for finding your way, or nobody can hear you on a call because you haven't given it permission for the microphone. Yeah, I think it's good, and it's quite intuitive the way that the settings are. Most of them are pretty, and then when they might be a bit more complicated, there's a little explanation-y thing, reading out what that's for. That's quite good.
Even I like the permissions manager, but one thing that I don't like is what Google has done is whenever you try to disable the permission for most of the apps, Google says, oh, there's an alert. This app was designed for an older version of Android and may not run correctly. This happens for most of the apps. So that Google should remove that, otherwise there is no use of the permission control.
I think that is probably generic, though, Austin, just like when you go to the Play Store and even apps that don't have any ads associated to them, you have that column that talks about, the ads. And so I think it's just a general whatever in the event that something doesn't work, then you have to give it that permissions because some of the apps, probably are from so many years ago. And so it's Google just trying to, cover all the bases. That's how I see it.
That could get annoying quite quickly if you're doing that permissions thing with lots of apps, though.
Yeah, well, it could be, but what we need to keep in mind is that not every version of Android has that support. And so that's why we see this thing going on. Because if you have an older device, it's one permission takes all, and that's what they're trying to prevent, and it's not good.